Section 15 of Hinduism and Buddhism, An Historical Sketch, Volume 1. Eastern Polytheism. Different as India and China are, they agree in this, that in order not to misapprehend their religious condition, we must make our minds familiar with a new set of relations. The relations of religion to philosophy, to ethics, and to the state, as well as the relations of different religions to one another, are not the same as in Europe. China and India are pagan, a word which I deprecate if it is understood to imply inferiority, but which, if used in a descriptive and respectful sense, is very useful. Christianity and Islam are organized religions. They say, or rather their several sects say, that they each not only possess the truth, but that all other creeds and rites are wrong. But paganism is not organized. It rarely presents anything like a church united under one head. Still more rarely does it condemn or interfere with other religions unless attacked first. Buddhism stands between the two classes. Like Christianity and Islam, it professes to teach the only true law, but unlike them, it is exceedingly tolerant, and many Buddhists also worship Hindu or Chinese gods. Popular religion in India and China is certainly polytheistic. Yet if one uses this word in contrast to the monotheism of Islam and of Protestantism, the antithesis is unjust, for the polytheist does not believe in many creators and rulers of the world, in many Allahs or Jehovahs, but he considers that there are many spiritual beings with different spheres and powers, to the most appropriate of whom he addresses his petitions. Polytheism and image worship lie under an unmerited stigma in Europe. We generally assume that to believe in one God is obviously better, intellectually and ethically, than to believe in many. Yet Trinitarian religions escape being polytheistic only by juggling with words, and if Hindus and Chinese are polytheists, so are the Roman and Oriental churches, for there is no real distinction between praying to the Madonna, saints and angels, and propitiating minor deities. William James has pointed out that polytheism is not theoretically absurd, and is practically the religion of many Europeans. In some ways it is more intelligible and reasonable than monotheism. For if there is only one personal God, I do not understand how anything that can be called a person can be so expanded as to be capable of hearing and answering the prayers of the whole world. Anything susceptible of such extension must be more than a person. Is it not at least equally reasonable to assume that there are many spirits or many shapes taken by the superpersonal world spirit with which the soul can get into touch? The worship of images cannot be recommended without qualification, for it seems to require artists capable of making a worthy representation of the divine. And it must be confessed that many figures in Indian temples, such as the statues of Kali, seem repulsive or grotesque, though a Hindu might say that none of them are so strange an idea or so horrible in appearance as the crucifix. But the claim of the iconoclast from the times of the Old Testament onwards, that he worships a spirit whereas others worship wood and stone, is true only of the lowest phases of religion, if even there. Hindu theologians distinguish different kinds of avatars, or ways in which God descends into the world. Among them are incarnations like Krishna, the presence of God in the human heart, and his presence in a symbol or image, arka. It may be difficult to decide how far the symbol and the spirit are kept separate either in the East or in Europe. But no one can attend a greater car festival in southern India or the feast of Durga in Bengal without feeling and in some measure sharing the ecstasy and enthusiasm of the crowd. It is an enthusiasm such as may be evoked in critical times by a king or a flag, and as the flag may do duty for the king and all that he stands for, so may the image do duty for the deity. End of section 15. The Extravagance of Hinduism. What I have just said applies to India rather than to China, and so do the observations which follow. India is the most religious country in the world. The percentage of people who literally make religion their chief business, who sacrifice to it money and life itself, for religious suicide is not extinct, is far greater than elsewhere. Russia probably comes next, but the other nations fall behind by a long interval. Footnote. And in Russia there are sects which prescribe castration and suicide. End footnote. Matter of fact, respectable people, Chinese as well as Europeans, call this attitude extravagance, and it sometimes deserves the name. For since there is no one creed or criterion in India, all sorts of aboriginal or decadent superstitions command the respect due to the name of religion. This extravagance is both intellectual and moral. No story is too extraordinary to be told of Hindu gods. They are the magicians of the universe, who sport with the forces of nature as easily as a conjurer in a bazaar does tricks with a handful of balls. But though the average Hindu would be shocked to hear the Puranas described as idle tales, yet he does not make his creed depend on their accuracy, as many in Europe make Christianity depend on miracles. The value of truth in religion is rated higher in India than in Europe, but it is not historical truth. The Hindu approaches his sacred literature somewhat in the spirit in which we approach Milton and Dante. The beauty and value of such poems is clear. The question whether they are accurate reports or facts seems irrelevant. Hindus believe in progressive revelation. Many Tantras and Vishnunite works profess to be better suited to the present age than the Vedas, and innumerable treatises in the vernacular are commonly accepted as scripture. Scriptures in India. Footnote. This, of course, does not apply to Buddhism in China, Japan, and Tibet. End footnote. Are thought of as words, not writings. It is the sacred sound, not a sacred book, which is venerated. They are learnt by oral transmission, and it is rare to see a book used in religious services. Diagrams, accompanied by letters and a few words, are credited with magical powers. But still, tantric spells are things to be recited rather than written. This view of Scripture makes the hearer uncritical. The ordinary layman hears parts of a sacred book recited and probably admires what he understands, but he has no means of judging a book as a whole, especially of its coherency and consistency. The moral extravagance of Hinduism is more serious. It is kept in check by the general conviction that asceticism, or at least temperance, charity, and self-effacement, are the indispensable outward signs of religion. But still, among the great religions of the world, there is none which countenances so many hysterical, immoral, and cruel rites. A literary example will illustrate the position. It is taken from the drama Madhava, a Malati written about 730 A.D., but the incidents of the plot might happen in any native state today, if European supervision were removed. In it, Madhava, a young Brahmin, surprises a priest of the goddess Chamunda, who is about to immolate Malati. He kills the priest, and apparently the other characters consider his conduct natural and not sacrilegious. But it is not suggested that either the police or any ecclesiastical authority ought to prevent human sacrifices, and the reason why Madhava was able to save his beloved from death was that he had gone to the uncanny spot where such rites were performed to make an offering of human flesh to demons. In Buddhism, religion and the moral law are identified, but not in Hinduism. Brahmanical literature contains beautiful moral sayings, especially about unselfishness and self-restraint. But the greatest popular gods, such as Vishnu and Shiva, are not identified with the moral law. They are supermoral, and the god of philosophy, who is all things, is also above good and evil. The aim of the philosophic saint is not so much to choose the good and eschew evil, as to draw nearer to God by rising above both. Indian literature as a whole has a strong ethical and didactic flavor, yet the great philosophic and religious systems concern themselves little with ethics. They discuss the nature of the external world and other metaphysical questions which seem to us hardly religious. They clearly feel a particular interest in defining the relation of the soul to God, but they rarely ask, "Why should I be good?" or "What is the sanction of morality?" They are concerned less with sin than with ignorance, Virtue is indispensable, but without knowledge it is useless. End of section 16.
The Hindu and Buddhist Scriptures. The history and criticism of Hindu and Buddhist scriptures naturally occupy some space in this work, but two general remarks may be made here. First, the oldest scriptures are almost without exception compilation, that is, collection of utterances handed down by tradition and arranged by later generations in some form which gives them apparent unity. Thus, the Rig Veda is obviously an anthology of hymns, and some 3,000 years later, the Granth, or sacred book of the Sikhs, was compiled on the same principle. It consists of poems by Nanak, Kabir, and many other writers, but is treated with extraordinary respect as a continuous and consistent revelation. The Brahmans and Upanishads are not such obvious compilation, yet on a careful inspection, the older ones will be found to be nothing else. Footnote 63. This is not true of the more modern Upanishads, which are often short treatises specially written to extol a particular deity or doctrine. End footnote. Thus, the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, though possessing considerable coherency, is not only a collection of such philosophic views as commended themselves to the doctors of Taittiriya school, but it is formed by the union of three such collections. Each of the first two collections ends with a list of the teachers who handed it down, and the third is openly called a supplement. One long passage, the dialogue between Yajnavalkya and his wife, is incorporated in both the first and the second collection. Thus our text represents the period when the Taittiriyas brought their philosophic thoughts together in a complete form, but that period was preceded by another in which slightly different schools had their own collection, and for some time before this the various maxims and dialogues must have been current separately. Since the conversation between Yajnavalkya and Maitri occurs in almost the same form in two collections, it probably once existed as an independent piece. In Buddhist literature, the composite and tertiary character of the Sutta Pitaka is equally plain. The various Nikayas are confessedly collections of discourses. The two older ones seem dominated by the desire to bring before the reader the image of the Buddha preaching. The Sanyukta and Anguttara emphasize the doctrine rather than the teacher and arrange much the same matter under new headings. But it is clear that in whatever form the various sermons, dialogues, and dissertations appear, that form is not primary but presupposes compilers dealing with an oral tradition already stereotyped in language. For long passages such as the tract on morality and the description of progress in the religious life occur in several discourses, and the amount of matter common to different sutta and nikayas is surprising. Thus nearly the whole of the long sutta describing the Buddha's last days and death, which at first sight seemed to be a connected narrative somewhat different from other suttas, is found scattered in other parts of the canon. Footnote 64. Mahaparinibbana Sutta. See the table of parallel passages prefixed to Rhys Davids' translation, Dialogues of the Buddha, 272. End footnote. Thus our oldest text, whether Brahmanic or Buddhists, are additions and codifications, perhaps amplifications, of a considerably older oral teaching. They cannot be treated as personal documents similar to the Quran or the epistles of Paul. The works of Middle Antiquity, such as the epics, Purans, and Mahayanist sutras, were also not produced by one author. Many of them exist in more than one recension and then usually consist of a nucleus enveloped and sometimes itself affected by additions which may exceed the original matter in bulk. The Mahabharata and Prajna Paramita are not books in the European sense. We cannot give a date or a table of contents for the first edition. They each represent a body of literature whose composition extend over a long period. Footnote 65. Much the same is true of the various editions of the Vinaya and Mahavatsu. These texts were produced by a process first of collection and then of amplification. End footnote. As time goes on, history naturally grows clearer and literary personalities become more distinct. Yet the later Purans are not attributed to human authors and were susceptible of interpolation even in recent times. Thus, the story of Genesis has been incorporated in the Bhavishya Puran, apparently after Protestant missionaries had begun to preach in India. The other point to which I would draw attention is the importance of relatively modern works which supersede the older scriptures, especially in Hinduism. This phenomenon is common in many countries, for only a few books such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Gospels and the sayings of Confucius have a portion of the eternal and universal sufficient to outlast the wear and tear of 1,000 years. Vedic literature is far from being discredited in India, though some tantras say openly that it is useless. It still has a place in ritual and is appealed to by reforming sects. But to see Hinduism in proper perspective, we must remember that from the time of the Buddha till now, the composition of religious literature in India has been almost uninterrupted, and that almost every century has produced works accepted by some sect as infallible scriptures. For most Vishnuites, the Bhagavad Gita is the beginning of sacred literature, and the Narayaniya is also held in high esteem. Footnote 66. The latter part of Mahabharata 11. End footnote. The philosophy of each sect is usually determined by a commentary on the Brahma Sutra. The Bhagavad Puran, perhaps in a vernacular paraphrase, and the Ramayana of Tulsidas are probably the favorite reading of the laity, and for devotional purposes may be supplemented by a collection of hymns such as Nam Ghoshna, copies of which actually receive homage in Assam. The average man, even the average priest, regards all these as sacred works without troubling himself with distinctions as to Shruti and Smritis, and the Vedas and Upanishads are hardly within his horizon. In respect of sacred literature, Buddhism is more conservative than Hinduism, or to put it another way, has been less productive in the last 1500 years. The Hinayanists are like those Protestant sects which still profess not to go beyond the Bible. The monks read the Abhidhamma and the laity the Suttas, though perhaps both are disposed to use extracts and compendiums rather than full ancient texts. Among the Mahayanists, the ancient Vinaya and Nikayas exist only as literary curiosities. The former is superseded by modern manuals, the latter by Mahayanist sutras such as the Lotus and the Happy Land, which are however of respectable antiquity. As in India, each sect selects rather arbitrarily a few books for its own use without condemning others, but also without according to them the formal recognition received by the Old and New Testaments among Christians. No Asiatic country possesses so large a portion of the critical spirit as China. The educated Chinese, however, much they may venerate their classics, think of them as we think of the masterpieces of Greek literature, as texts which may contain wrong readings, interpolations, and lacunae, which owe whatever authority they possess to the labors of the scholars who collected, arranged, and corrected them. This attitude is to some extent the result of the attempt made by the first emperor about 200 BC to destroy the classical literature and to its subsequent laborious restoration. At a time when the Indians regarded the Veda as a verbal revelation, certain and divine in every syllable, the Chinese were painfully recovering and repiecing their ancient chronicles and poems from imperfect manuscripts and fallible memories. The process obliged them to inquire at every step whether the text which they examined were genuine and complete, to admit that they might be defective or paraphrases of a difficult original. Hence the Chinese have sound principles of criticism unknown to the Hindus, and in discussing the date of an ancient work or the probability of an alleged historical event, they generally use arguments which a European scholar can accept. Chinese literature has a strong ethical and political flavor which temper the extravagance of imported Indian ideas. Most Chinese systems assert more or less plainly that right conduct is conduct in harmony with the laws of the state and the universe. End of section 17. Morality and will. It is dangerous to make sweeping statements about the huge mass of Indian literature, but I think that most Buddhist and Brahmanic systems assume that morality is merely a means of obtaining happiness and is not obedience to a categorical imperative or to the will of God. Footnote 67. Though European religions emphasize man's duty to God, they do not exclude the pursuit of happiness. Example, Westminster Shorter Catechism 1647. Question 1. What is the chief end of man? Answer. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. End footnote. Morality is by inference raised to the status of a cosmic law because evil deeds will infallibly bring evil consequences to the doer in this life or another, but it is not commonly spoken of as such a law. The usual point of view is that man desires happiness, and for this morality is a necessary though insufficient preparation. But there may be higher states which cannot be expressed in terms of happiness. The will receives more attention in European philosophy than in Indian, whether Buddhist or Brahmanic, which both regard it not as a separate kind of activity but as a form of thought. As such, it is not neglected in Buddhist psychology. Will, desire, and struggle are recognized as good, provided their object is good, a point overlooked by those who accuse Buddhism of preaching inaction. Footnote 68. Mrs. Rhys Davids has brought out the importance of the will for Buddhist ethics in several works. See JRAS 1898, page 47, and Buddhism, pages 221 FF. See also Major Nick 19 for a good example of Buddhist views as to the necessity and method of cultivating the will. End footnote. Schopenhauer's doctrine that will is the essential fact in the universe and in life may appear to have analogies to Indian thought. It would be easy, for instance, to quote passages from the Pitaks showing that tanha, thirst, craving or desire, is the force which makes and remakes the world. But such statements must be taken as generalizations respecting the world as it is rather than an implying theory of its origin, for though tanha is a link in the chain of causation, it is not regarded as an ultimate principle more than any other link, but is made to depend on feeling. The Maya of the Vedanta is not so much the affirmation of the will to live as the illusion that we have a real existence apart from Brahman, and the same may be said of Ahankar in the Sankhya philosophy. It is the principle of egoism and individuality, but its essence is not so much self-assertion as the mistaken idea that this is mine, that I am happy or unhappy. There is a question much debated in European philosophy but little argued in India, namely the freedom of the will. The active European feeling, the obligation and the difficulties of morality is perplexed by the doubt whether he really has the power to act as he wishes. This problem has not much troubled the Hindus, and rightly, as I think, for if the human will is not free, what does freedom mean? What example of freedom can be quoted with which to contrast the supposed non-freedom of the will? If, in fact, it is from the will that our notion of freedom is derived, is it not unreasonable to say that the will is not free? Absolute freedom, in the sense of something regulated by no laws, is unthinkable. When a thing is conditioned by external causes, it is dependent. When it is conditioned by internal causes, which are part of its own nature, it is free. No other freedom is known. An Indian would say that a man's nature is limited by karma. Some minds are incapable of the higher forms of virtue and wisdom, just as some bodies are incapable of athletic feats. But within the limits of its own nature, a human being is free. Indian theology is not much hampered by the mad doctrine that God has predestined some soul to damnation, nor by the idea of fate, except insofar as karma is fate. It is fate in the sense that karma inherited from a previous birth is a store of rewards and punishments which must be enjoyed or endured. But it differs from fate because we are all the time making our own karma and determining the character of our next birth. The older Upanishads hint at a doctrine analogous to that of Kant, namely that man is bound and conditioned insofar as he is a part of the world of phenomena, but free insofar as the self within him is identical with the divine self, which is the creator of all bonds and conditions. Thus, the Kaushitaki Upanishad says, "He it is who causes the man whom he will lead upwards from these worlds to do good works, and he it is who causes the man whom he will lead downwards to do evil works. He is the guardian of the world. He is the ruler of the world. He is the Lord of the world, and he is myself." Here the last words destroy the apparent determinism of the first part of the sentence, and similarly, Chandogya Upanishad says, "They who depart hence without having known the self and those true desires, for them there is no freedom in all worlds. But they who depart hence after knowing the self and those true desires, for them there is freedom in all worlds." Footnote 70. The words are Kamakara and Akamakara. Chandogya Upanishad 8, 1-6. End footnote. Early Buddhist literature asserts uncompromisingly that every state of consciousness has a cause, and in one of his earliest discourses, the Buddha argues that the skandhas, including mental states, cannot be the self because we have not free will to make them exactly what we choose. Footnote 71. Mahavag 1:6. Example. Ajatsattu would have obtained the eye of the truth had he not been a parricide. The consequent distortion of mind made higher states impossible. End footnote. But throughout his ethical teaching, it is, I think, assumed that, subject to the law of karma, conscious action is equivalent to spontaneous action. Good mental states can be made to grow and bad mental states to decrease until the stage is reached when the saint knows that he is free. It may perhaps be thought that the early Buddhists did not realize the consequences of applying their doctrine of causation to psychology and hence never faced the possibility of determinism. But determinism, fatalism, and the uselessness of effort formed part of the paradoxical teaching of Macaulay Ghosla reported in the Pitaks and therefore well known. If neither the Jains nor Buddhists allowed themselves to be embarrassed by such denials of free will, the inference is that in some matters at least the Hindus had strong common sense and declined to accept any view which takes away from man the responsibility and lordship of his own soul. End of section 18. Hinduism and Buddhism, an Historical Sketch, Volume 1, by Charles Eliot, The Origin of Evil. The reader will have gathered from what precedes that Hinduism has little room for the devil. Footnote 72. But all general statements about Hinduism are liable to exceptions. The evil spirit dosas described in the Markandeya Puran, chapter 50 and 51, comes very near the devil. End footnote. Buddhism, being essentially an ethical system, recognizes the importance of the tempter or Mara, but still Mara is not an evil spirit who has spoilt a good world. In Hinduism, whether pantheistic or polytheistic, there is even less disposition to personify evil in one figure, and most Indian religious systems are disposed to think of the imperfections of the world as suffering rather than as sin. Yet the existence of evil is the chief reason for the existence of religion, at least of such religions as promise salvation, and the explanation of evil is the chief problem of all religions and philosophies, and the problem which they all alike are conspicuously unsuccessful in solving. I can assign no reason for rejecting as untenable the idea that the ultimate reality may be a duality, a good and an evil spirit, or even a plurality, but still it is unthinkable for me, and I believe for most minds. Footnote 73. I can understand that the immediate reality is a duality or plurality, and that the one spirit may appear in many shapes. End footnote. If there are two ultimate beings, either they must be complementary and necessary one to the other, in which case it seems to me more correct to describe them as two aspects of one being, or if they are quite separate, my mind postulates, but I do not know why, a third being who is the cause of them both. The problem of evil is not quite the same for Indian and European pantheists. The European pantheists hold that since God is all things, or in all things, evil is only something viewed out of due perspective, that the world would be seen to be perfect if it could be seen as a whole, or that evil will be eliminated in the course of development. But he cannot explain why the partial view of the world which human beings are obliged to take shows the existence of obvious evil. The Hindus think that it is possible and better for the soul to leave the vain show of the world and find peace and union with God. They are therefore not concerned to prove that the world is good, although they cannot explain why God allows it to exist. The Upanishads contain some myths and parables about the introduction of evil, but they do not say that a naturally good world was spoiled. Footnote 74. Example given, Chand Upanishad 5.1.2, Bri Ar Upanishad 1.3. In the Panchatantra, we do hear of a Jnana Brahmasa, or a fall from knowledge analogous to the fall of a man in Christian theology. Souls have naturally unlimited knowledge, but this from some reason becomes limited and obscured, so that religion is necessary to show the soul the right way. Here the ground idea seems to be not that any devil has spoiled the world, but that ignorance is necessary for the world process, for otherwise mankind would be one with God and there would be no other world. See Schrader, Introduction to Panchatantra, pages 78 and 83. End footnote. They rather imply that increasing complexity involves the increase of evil as well as of good. This is also the ground thought of the Aganya Sutta, the Buddhist Genesis, Digambra Nikaya 27. I think that the substance of much Indian pantheism, late Buddhist as well as Brahmanic, is that the world, the soul, and God, the three terms being practically the same, have two modes of existence, one of repose and bliss, the other of struggle and trouble. Of these, the first mode is better, and it is only by mistake that the eternal spirit adopts the latter. The Sattapatha Brahmana has a curious legend, 11.1.6.8 ff, in which the Creator admits that he made evil spirit by mistake and smites them. In the Karika of Gaudapada 2.19, it is actually said, Maheshya tatsya devasya yaya samohita swayam. End footnote. But both the mistakes and the correction of it are being eternally repeated. Such a formulation of Advaita philosophy would no doubt be regarded in India as wholly unorthodox. Yet, orthodoxy admits that the existence of the world is due to coexistence of Maya, illusion, with Brahman, spirit, and also states that the task of the soul is to pass beyond Maya to Brahman. If this is so, there is either a real duality, Brahman and Maya, or else Maya is an aspect of Brahman, but an aspect which the soul should transcend and avoid, and for whose existence no reason whatever is given. The more theistic forms of Indian religion, whether Shaivite or Vaishnavite, tend to regard individual souls and matter as eternal. By the help of God, souls can obtain release from matter. But here again, there is no explanation why the soul is contaminated by matter or ignorance. It is clearly illogical to condemn the infinite as bad or a mistake. Buddhism is perhaps sometimes open to this charge because on account of its exceedingly cautious language about nirvana, it fails to set it up as a reality contrasted with the world of suffering. But many varieties of Indian religion do empathetically point to the infinite reality behind and beyond Maya. It is only Maya which is unsatisfactory because it is partial. Another attempt to make the universe intelligible regards it as an eternal rhythm playing and pulsing outward from spirit to matter, pravritti, and then backwards and inwards from matter to spirit, nirvritti. This idea seems implied by Sanskara's view that creation is similar to the sportive impulse of exuberant youth, and the Bhagavad Gita is familiar with pravritti and nirvritti, but the double character of the rhythm is emphasized most clearly in Shakta treatises. Ordinary Hinduism concentrates its attention on the process of liberation and return to Brahman, but the Tantras recognize and consecrate both movements, the outward throbbing streams of energy and enjoyment, bhakti, and the calm returning flow of liberation and peace. Both are happiness, but the wise understand that the active outward movement is right and happy only up to a certain point and under certain restrictions. That great poet Tulsidas hints at an explanation of the creation or of God's expansion of himself which will perhaps commend itself to Europeans more than most Indian ideas, namely that the bliss enjoyed by God and the souls whom he loves is greater than the bliss of solitary divinity. Footnote 76. He does not say this expressly, and it requires careful statement in India, where it is held strongly that God being perfect cannot add to his bliss, or perfection by creating anything. Compare Dante Paradiso 29:13-18. Non per aversi de bene questo, che essere non può, ma perché suo splendore potesse risplendendo dir subsisto, in sua eterna di tempo fuori di ogni altro comprende, come piace, si aspersi in nuovi amori eterno amore. End footnote. End of section 19. Hinduism and Buddhism, an Historical Sketch, Volume 1, by Charles Eliot, Church and State. I will now turn to another point, namely the relations of church and state. These are simplest in Buddhism, which teaches that the truth is one, that all men ought to follow it, and that all good kings should honor and encourage it. This is also the Christian position, but Buddhism has almost always been tolerant and has hardly ever countenanced the doctrine that error should be suppressed by force. Footnote 77. The history of Japan and Tibet offers some exceptions. End footnote. Buddhism does not claim to cover the whole field of religion as understood in Europe. If people like to propitiate spirits in the hope of obtaining wealth and crops, it permits them to do so. In Japan and Tibet, Buddhism has played a more secular role than in other countries, analogous to the struggles of the medieval European Church for temporal authority. In Japan, the great monasteries very nearly became the chief military as well as the chief political power, and this danger was averted only by the destruction of Heian and other large establishments in the 16th century. What was prevented in Japan did actually happen in Tibet, for the monasteries became stronger than any of the competing secular factions, and the principal sect set up an ecclesiastical government singularly like the papacy. In southern countries, such as Burma and Ceylon, Buddhism made no attempt to interfere in politics. This aloofness is particularly remarkable in Siam and Cambodia, where state festivals are usually conducted by Brahmins and not by Buddhist ecclesiastics. In Siam, as formerly in Burma, the king, being a Buddhist, is in some ways the head of the church. He may reform lax discipline or incorrect observances, but apparently not of his own authority, but merely as an executive power enforcing the opinion of the higher clergy. Buddhism and Hinduism both have the idea that the monk or priest is a person who, in virtue of ordination or birth, lives on a higher level than others. He may teach and do good, but irrespective of that, it is the duty of the laity to support the priesthood. This doctrine is preached by Hinduism in a stronger form than by Buddhism. The intellectual superiority of the Brahmins as a caste was sufficiently real to ensure its acceptance, and in politics they had the good sense to rule by serving, to be ministers and not kings. In theory, and to a considerable extent, in practice, the Brahmins and their gods are not an imperium in imperio, but an imperium super imperium. The position was possible only because, unlike the papacy and unlike the lamas of Tibet, they had no pope and no hierarchy. They produced no Becket or Hildebrands and no inquisitions. They did not quarrel with science but monopolized it. In India, kings are expected to maintain the priesthood and the temples, yet Hinduism rarely assumes the form of a state religion, nor does it admit, as state religions generally have to admit, that the secular arm has a coordinate jurisdiction in ecclesiastical matters. Footnote 78. There are some exceptions. Example given, ancient Cambodia, the Sikhs, and the Marathas. End footnote. Yet it affects every department of social life, and a Hindu who breaks with it loses his social status. Hindu deities are rarely tribal gods like Athene of Athens or the gods of Mr. Kipling and the German emperor. There are thousands of shrines specially favored by a divine presence, but the worshippers think of that presence not as the protector of a race or city, but as a special manifestation of a universal though often invisible power. The conquests of Mohammedans and Christians are not interpreted as meaning that the gods of Hinduism have succumbed to alien deities. The views prevalent in China and Japan as to the relations of church and state are almost the antipodes of those described. In those countries, it is hardly dissembled theory of the official world that religion is a department of government and that there should be regulations for good and worship just as there are for ministers and etiquette. If we say that religion is identified with the government in Tibet and forms an imperium super imperium in India, we may compare its position in the Far East to native states under British rule. There is no interference with creeds provided they respect ethical and social conventions. Interesting doctrines and rites are appreciated. The government accepts and rewards the loyal cooperation of the Buddhist and Taoist priesthoods, but maintains the right to restrict their activity should it take a wrong political turn or should an excessive increase in the number of monks seem a public danger. The Chinese imperial government successfully claimed the strangest powers of ecclesiastical discipline, since it promoted and degraded not only priests but deities. In both China and Japan, there has often been a strong current of feeling in the official classes against Buddhism, but on the other hand, it often had the support of both emperors and people, and princes not infrequently joined the clergy, especially when it was desirable for them to live in retirement. Confucianism and Shintoism, which are ethical and ceremonial rather than doctrinal, have been in the past to some extent a law to the governments of China and Japan, or more accurately an aspect of those governments. But for many centuries, Far Eastern statesmen have rarely regarded Buddhism and Taoism as more than interesting and legitimate activities to be encouraged and regulated like educational and scientific institutions. End of section 20.